Hi, my name's Andrew Francis, and today we're going to be looking at Isaiah chapter 37, verses 8 to 38. I'll begin by reading verses 8 to 13. The Rabshakeh returned and found the king of Assyria fighting against Libnah, for he had heard that the king had left Lachish. Now the king heard concerning Tahaka, king of Cush. He has set out to fight against you. And when he heard it, he sent messengers to Hezekiah, saying, Thus shall you speak to Hezekiah, king of Judah. Do not let your God in whom you trust deceive you by promising that Jerusalem will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Behold, you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all lands, devoting them to destruction. And shall you be delivered? Have the gods of the nations delivered them, the nations that my fathers destroyed, Gozan, Haran, Rezeph, and the people of Eden, who are in Telassar? Where is the king of Hamath, the king of Arpad, the king of the city of Sepharvaim, the king of Hena, or the king of Ivah? Now, we're not told why the Rabshakeh returned. It might have been that he'd expected Jerusalem to surrender, and when it didn't, he needed to get Sennacherib's word first before proceeding to a full-blown siege. But whatever the reason, we know that on his return, he finds Sennacherib and his armies engaged in conflict with a city called Libnah. This might simply have been a mopping up operation, or it might have been a maneuver to ensure that the Assyrians didn't find themselves hemmed in with potential attacks from the behind, with the Egyptians and the Judeans in front of them. In verse 9, we hear about an Ethiopian king, Tahaka. Now, there is some controversy concerning this reference, as Tahaka didn't become Egypt's king until 689 BC, which is after these events. Some commentators believe that the writer was referring to Tahaka in terms of what he later became, even though at this point this was not his position. Nonetheless, it seems as the Egyptians, under the leadership of Tahaka, are preparing to take on the Assyrian army again. And this requires Sennacherib to consolidate his army. The Rabshakeh could no longer lead a force against Jerusalem because he and his men are now needed. So the Rabshakeh takes this opportunity to send his messengers to Hezekiah to let him know that the war is not over and to try and convince him that trusting in God is a waste of time. The Rabshakeh lets Hezekiah know that Assyria has defeated many other nations, proving the powerlessness of their gods. And of course, the Rabshakeh is not only upping his own arrogance, but he is digging himself into a very deep pit by claiming that he can also treat the God of Judah and Israel in the same way that other gods have been treated. This is a real test of faith for Hezekiah. As Oswald points out, Hezekiah probably would have known of other kings who had also trusted oracles and prophecies, purportedly from their gods, and who had subsequently been flayed alive, impaled, mutilated, and killed. So what will the king do? In verses 14 to 20 we read, Hezekiah received the letter from the hand of the messengers and read it. And Hezekiah went up to the house of the Lord and spread it before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, O Lord of hosts, God of Israel, enthroned above the cherubim, you are the God, you alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. Incline your ear, O Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, O Lord, and see, and hear all the words of Sennacherib, which he has sent to mock the living God. Truly, O Lord, the kings of Assyria have laid waste all the nations and their lands, and have cast their gods into the fire. For they were no gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone, therefore they were destroyed. So now, O Lord our God, save us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are the Lord. Hezekiah reads the letter from the Rabshakeh and immediately does the same thing that he has done before. He goes to the temple to pray and seek the Lord. And Hezekiah spreads the letter before God as if in a symbolic way to make it clear to God the contents of this letter. We can see the change that has taken place in Hezekiah. No longer is he in sackcloth and ashes repenting and seeking God's mercy, not even daring to refer to God as his God. Now he prays with confidence, referring to God as the only God, the creator of all, the God seated above the cherubim, which was potentially a Hebrew way of describing both God's otherness and also his immanence. On one hand, he's related to the cherubim in the temple, describing his immanence. On the other, the Hebrew word for sitting suggests something more than he is somehow defined by his relationship to the cherubim. And Hezekiah refers to God as a living God. Unlike the gods of other nations, Sennacherib has defeated gods who are dead, inanimate objects, gods that could be burnt and easily destroyed. The God of Judah, however, is beyond everything else. And as in his previous prayer, Hezekiah asked God to intervene, not for Hezekiah's sake or for Judah's sake, but for the sake of his own glory. So now, O Lord our God, save us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are God. Again, to quote John Oswald, how often the outcome of our lives and our praying might be different if we focus first upon God's glory and upon his reputation, believing that all would be well if his name was well served. All too often our well-being is the end and God is only a means to that end. And so we read verses 21 to 29. Then Isaiah the son of Amoz sent to Hezekiah, saying, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, because you have prayed to me concerning Sennacherib, king of Assyria, this is the word that the Lord has spoken concerning him. She despises you. She scorns you. The virgin daughter of Zion, she wags her head behind you, the daughter of Jerusalem, whom you have mocked and reviled. Or whom have you mocked and reviled? Against whom have you raised your voice and lifted your eyes to the heights? Against the Holy One of Israel. By your servants you have mocked the Lord, and you have said, With my many chariots I've gone up to the heights of the mountains, to the far recesses of Lebanon, to cut down its tallest cedars, its choicest cypresses, to come to its remotest height, its most fruitful forest. I dug wells and drank waters, to dry it with the sole of my foot of the streams of Egypt. Well, have you not heard that I determined it long ago? I planned from days of old what now I bring to pass, that you should make fortified cities crash into heaps of ruins, while their inhabitants, shorn of strength, are dismayed and confounded, and have become like plants of the field and like tender grass, like grass on the housetops, blighted before it's grown. I know you're sitting down, and you're going out and coming in, and you're raging against me. Because you have raged against me and your complacency has come to my ears, I will put my hook in your nose and my bit in your mouth, and I will turn you back on the way by which you came. We can also see how the response from God to Hezekiah's second faith-filled prayer is also much stronger. The Hebrew indicates that God's response through Isaiah to Hezekiah's prayer is immediate. I love how John Oswald puts this. Sennacherib has spoken to Hezekiah concerning the Lord. Hezekiah has spoken to the Lord concerning Sennacherib. Now the Lord speaks to Hezekiah concerning Sennacherib. And of course, what ultimately matters is not what Sennacherib says concerning Hezekiah or what Hezekiah says concerning Sennacherib. What ultimately matters is what God has to say. What Sennacherib has said concerning himself and his own accomplishments are also of little concern to God. Again, Oswald suggests that it's like a swaggering rapist before an innocent young girl. With God's intervention, that girl can mock the impotence of this man. And so Isaiah makes it clear it's not people that have been mocked, but God. Sennacherib has sent his lackeys to poke fun at the Holy One of Israel. Sennacherib has boasted their power, their technology, their superior forces, their many accomplishments over people and nation. But in verses 26 to 27, God lets Sennacherib know that all that he has accomplished was determined by God. God knew of it well before Sennacherib was even thought of or brought to birth. Not only did God know of it, but God was the one who planned it. Everything Sennacherib might boast of was simply him fulfilling God's purposes for his life. Don Francisco, in his song Balaam, puts this very well. The Lord's the one who makes the choice of the instruments he's using. We don't know the reasons and the plans behind his choosing. So when the Lord starts using you, don't pay it any mind. He could have used the dog next door if he'd been so inclined. Finally, in language that reminds us of Psalm 139, God lets Sennacherib know that he knows about every detail of Sennacherib's life. God knows of Sennacherib's arrogance and boastfulness before God, and because of the willful determination to try and usurp God and his purposes, God is going to intervene and to take Sennacherib back to where he came from against his wills and his plans. I'll just read you the words of Psalm 139, verses 1 to 18. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain it. Where shall I go from your spirit, or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you, the night is bright as the day. For darkness is as light with you, for you form my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you, when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them. The days that you formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. How precious to me are your thoughts, O Lord. How vast is the sum of them. If I would count them, they are more than the sand. I awake and I am still with you. Whilst I know that it's not always a comfort to us to be aware of God's intimate knowledge of us and our ways, generally the sense of Psalm 139 and God's knowledge of us is actually meant to be a comfort to us. The God who knows us and loves us and looks out for us is a beautiful thought. This same knowledge of Sennacherib is terrifying and disturbing, however. For those opposed to God, it would be far more comforting to imagine that God cannot see or hear. In verses 30 to 35 we read, "And this shall be the sign for you. This year you shall eat what grows of itself, and in the second year what springs from that. Then in the third year sow and reap and plant vineyards and eat their fruit. And the surviving remnant of the house of Judah shall again take root downward and bear fruit upward. For out of Jerusalem shall go a remnant, and out of Mount Zion a band of survivors. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. Therefore thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into this city, or shoot an arrow there, or come before it with a shield, or cast up a siege mound against it. By the way that he came, by the same he shall return, and he shall not come into this city, declares the Lord, for I will defend this city to save it, for my own sake and for the sake of my servant David." In chapters 7 to 12 of Isaiah had also offered King Ahaz a sign. Ahaz refused to ask for a sign, and Isaiah gave him one anyway. Now Isaiah doesn't ask Hezekiah to choose a sign, he simply gives him one as proof that God will fulfill what he's promised. Whilst there's some question regarding the time frame of the sign offered, whether it was over a period of 3 literal years or over 1.5 years, and thereby encompassing 3 different years, the sign is quite simple. The land has been devastated by invading armies. The usual sowing and reaping of crops has been stopped, and therefore the only crops likely to appear are those that have come from spilled seed. Now the Assyrians have withdrawn, the Judeans can now begin to sow crops again, at the right time of year of course, and then also harvest the crops that they have sown. This uninterrupted cycle and its concluding fruitfulness will be evidence that the Assyrians will never fulfill their promise to return and carry out their threats to destroy Jerusalem. Isaiah then uses the symbolic nature of the sign to point to the survival and fruitfulness of the remnant left. Judah has been overrun, her people decimated by the Assyrian incursion, but God will still fulfill his purposes with those who are left. As always, I'm reminded of the story of Gideon. God often has to reduce his people to almost nothing for them to be fit and ready for his purposes. And this is always so that they will not boast of their own conquests, as if these conquests were accomplished by their own power and strength. God often does the same to us. He reduces us to nothing, so that we lose all trust in our own abilities or strength, and then he calls us and he uses us for his purposes and plans. Isaiah makes it clear that not an arrow will be fired into the city or any siege works laid against the city. Despite the Assyrian threats and their power to carry out such threats, God's promise is they will cause no damage whatsoever to his people and his city. God does this for his own name's sake, and also for the sake of his king. And again, as Oswald points out, this is not simply about fulfilling some covenant to David, as there are other Davidic kings that God allows to fall. Later on, Jerusalem does fall and her king is sent into exile. Rather, Oswald suggests that because Jerusalem and her remnant people were protected by God's intervention at this point, out of this remnant, God's true king and descendant of David, Jesus, can be born. The purposes and plans of God cannot be thwarted. And so we read verses 36 to 38. "And the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when people arose early in the morning, behold, these were all dead bodies. Then Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived at Nineveh. And as he was worshipping in the house of Nisroch his god, Adramelech and Sharezer his sons struck him down with the sword. And after they escaped into the land of Ararat, Esarhaddon his son reigned in his place." In response to Assyrian arrogance and Hezekiah's faith-filled prayer, God acted decisively, and the Assyrian army was decimated by the angel of the Lord. There are other records from the Egyptian Herodotus speaking of mice eating all the Assyrian bow strings, causing them to take flight. Now this might be a reference to a plague caused by mice, like the bubonic plague. However we understand it, there is another historic record pointing to what Isaiah is describing. The other reality is that Sennacherib did live for another 20 years after this flight with his army, but he accomplished little else of note in that time. It's also of significance that he was murdered in the temple of his God by his own two sons. The one who makes light of the God of Judah could not be protected in the temple of the God in whom he has put his faith. The great king has been brought to an untimely end in an incredibly humiliating way at the hands of his own children. All his idle boasts against Jerusalem and the God of Hezekiah, the God over all, have proven to be threats with no power and substance by someone who before the living God is nothing more than a shadow, a breath, here today and gone tomorrow. As James chapter 4 verse 14 tells us, what is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Now James could just as easily be speaking to a great king as to a beggar on the street. And so on one hand, we need to be very aware of the fragility of human life. And yet on the other hand, Jesus lets us know that despite our fragility, we are precious to God and he will indeed look after us as his people. Luke chapter 12 verse 22 to 34 puts it like this. And he said to his disciples, therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. For life is more than food and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap, they have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? And which of you by being anxious can add a single hour to his span of life? If then you are not able to do a smaller thing as that, why are you anxious about the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, yet I tell you even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today, and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? And do not seek what you are to eat and what you are to drink, nor be worried. For all the nations of the world seek after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. God bless you as you consider these words today.